There is a version of every Sigma male that has never been seen by another human being, not hidden deliberately, not concealed out of shame or strategy, simply never witnessed because the conditions required for it to surface do not exist in the presence of other people. It exists only in the hours alone, in the specific quality of thought that only arrives when nothing external is being managed, in the conversations he has with himself that never get translated into conversations with anyone else. Not because they are too private, but because language flattens them. And he has noticed this, and decided that some things are better left unflattened. What I want to do tonight is not describe his behavior. You already know his behavior. The silence, the standards, the discipline. I want to go inside, into the place where none of that originates from anything you can observe, into the actual experience of being him, from the inside, in the moments when nobody is watching and nothing is being performed. This is harder territory than usual. Some of it I am not fully certain about. Let's go there anyway. 7 points. Welcome to Silent Wise. 1. The conversation that never stops and why it sounds different from yours. In 1996, the psychologist Charles Fernyhough began researching what is now called inner speech, the internal monologue that runs in most people's minds more or less continuously. His later work, compiled in a 2016 book on the subject, made a finding that surprised even researchers in the field. Inner speech is not uniform. It varies dramatically between individuals in tone, in structure, and most significantly, in whose voice it uses. Many people's inner monologue is populated by other people's voices, a parent's judgment, a critic's tone, an imagined audience reacting to their choices in real time. The inner world for most people is not actually private. It is a kind of internal theater with a cast of remembered characters who never stop performing. The internal world of the Sigma male, to the extent that it can be described at all, is marked by something specific, a reduction in this cast, not its complete absence. He still carries voices from his past, as everyone does. But over years of deliberate solitude, the volume of those voices has been turned down, and what has grown louder in the silence they left is something closer to his own voice, unmixed, unperformed, not responding to anyone. This is genuinely strange to experience if you have not experienced it, and genuinely difficult to describe to someone who has not. The closest description I can offer is this. Most internal monologues are conversations. His, increasingly, is closer to observation. There is less debate happening inside him, less of the back and forth between his impulses and his internalized critics, because the critics have largely gone quiet. What remains is something flatter and stranger, not emptier, quieter. A mind that is no longer constantly defending itself to people who are not there. He did not engineer this. It happened gradually, as a consequence of removing himself from the environments that kept those voices active. And once he noticed it had happened, he understood something about his own development that no one had ever told him to look for, that the quality of your internal world is not fixed. It is shaped continuously by who you have given internal residence to, and residence can be revoked. 2. The specific discomfort of having no one to perform for. I want to describe something honestly here, because the clean version of this story skips it, and the clean version is not true. When the external audience disappears, when a man has genuinely stopped performing for anyone, even in the small ways most people do not notice they are performing, there is often, at first, a kind of vertigo. Irving Goffman, the sociologist who spent much of his career studying what he called the presentation of self, argued that human identity is largely constructed through performance, that we do not have a single fixed self so much as a series of performances calibrated to different audiences, and that even our private moments often carry residue of those performances. If this is true, then a man who removes the audiences does not simply reveal a hidden true self underneath. He encounters, for a period, something closer to absence. A self that was partly constituted by the performances now has fewer instructions for how to exist without them. This is the part of the internal world that nobody talks about, because it does not fit the narrative of quiet strength. There is a period, sometimes long, where the internal world of the Sigma male in its early formation is not peaceful. It is disorienting. Without an audience, without the social mirrors that used to tell him who he was being, there is a strange weightlessness. Who am I when no one is watching, and I am not even watching myself the way I used to? What happens next is the part that matters. He does not fill the space back up with old performances. He stays in the disorientation longer than is comfortable. And gradually, not through insight, mostly through repetition, something forms in that space that was not a performance to begin with. Slower, less defined, but his. The internal world that people eventually sense as depth was, at its origin, an absence that he did not rush to fill. Most people fill it immediately. He let it stay empty long enough for something real to grow there instead. 3. what he actually thinks about during the hours everyone assumes are wasted. In 2010, a Harvard study by Killingsworth and Gilbert used real-time sampling to track what people were thinking about during ordinary moments of their day, regardless of what they were doing. The headline finding was widely reported. People's minds wander roughly 47% of the time, and mind wandering correlated with lower reported happiness regardless of the activity being performed. What got less attention was the breakdown of what people's minds wandered toward. Overwhelmingly, toward social concerns, what someone said, how an interaction had gone, what to say in an upcoming one, how they were being perceived. The wandering mind for most people is a social simulator running almost constantly, even in solitude. The internal world of the Sigma male, during his unstructured hours, runs differently. And this is one of the genuinely distinctive features that nobody observing his behavior from outside would ever guess. His mind during quiet time tends not toward social simulation. It tends toward what I can only describe as structural curiosity, turning over how something works, why a pattern keeps repeating, what the actual mechanism is behind something he has observed but not yet understood. Not always productively, not always toward anything. Often just turning the thing over, because turning things over is what an unoccupied mind that has stopped running social simulations defaults to instead. This is not because he is incapable of social thought. It is because the social simulator, for most people, runs on unprocessed social material. Interactions that did not resolve, things that were said that still need responding to internally, relationships that require continuous internal maintenance even in absence. His internal world has less of this material because his external relationships generate less of it. Fewer unresolved threads, fewer interactions that need replaying. The mental bandwidth that would be consumed by that processing in most people is, in him, simply available. And what fills available bandwidth, in a mind like his, is whatever he was curious about before the bandwidth was needed for something else. I want to pause here for a moment, because everything I have described so far, the quieter inner voice, the tolerance for disorientation, the bandwidth that opens up when the social noise clears, none of it happens by accident. It is built through specific daily choices that most men never make, because nobody ever shows them what those choices look like in practice. That is exactly why I put together a short free guide called The Silent Discipline. It lays out the actual daily framework, not theory, the specific practices that create the internal conditions this video is describing. The link is in the description below this video. If anything in the first half of this video felt like something you have sensed in yourself but never had language for, this guide is the next step. It is free. Go get it. Then come back, because the next 4 points go somewhere I have not taken this channel before. 4. The relationship he has with time, that almost no one shares. In 1971, the psychologist Philip Zimbardo began research that would eventually become his time perspective theory. The idea that individuals develop characteristic orientations toward past, present, and future that shape almost every decision they make, usually without their awareness. Most people, his research found, default to a present hedonistic or past-oriented frame, depending on temperament and upbringing. They are oriented toward immediate experience or toward processing what has already happened. A smaller group develops what he called a future-oriented perspective, where present decisions are consistently filtered through their projected consequences. What Zimbardo's framework does not fully capture, and what I think is genuinely present in the internal world of the Sigma male, is something slightly different from future orientation in the way he described it. It is not primarily about planning, it is about scale. Internally, the Sigma male tends to experience the present moment as smaller than most people experience it. Not less important, but less totalizing. A bad day does not feel like the whole of his experience the way it might for someone whose internal clock runs primarily in present tense. There is almost always a quiet internal awareness of duration, that this moment is one moment among an enormous number of moments, most of which have not happened yet. This produces something specific internally that is difficult to convey from outside. A kind of calm that is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of scale. He feels the difficulty of a hard day fully, and simultaneously, somewhere in the same internal space, there is an awareness that this day is small. Both things are true at once, held without contradiction, in a way that most internal worlds, oriented more tightly around the present, do not naturally hold. This is not a trick he performs. It is closer to a default setting that develops slowly, through years of living with a long internal timeline, until the timeline itself became part of how every single moment feels. The present did not get less real, it just stopped being the entire frame. 5. The internal argument that almost never happens, and what replaces it. Psychologist Roy Baumeister's research on ego depletion. first published in the late 1990s and refined considerably since, examined what happens to self-control over the course of a day. The idea that resisting temptation, making decisions, and regulating behavior all draw from a common, limited resource that depletes with use. Later research complicated the original findings considerably, but one element has held up consistently across the debate. A significant amount of what feels like willpower is actually the cost of internal conflict, the energy spent on the argument between what you want to do and what you have decided you should do. The internal world of the Sigma male contains noticeably less of this argument than most people's. Not because he wants fewer things, and not because he has more willpower in the conventional sense. Because the gap between what he wants in the moment and what he has decided to do has, over years, narrowed. The argument used to happen. Everyone's argument happens early on. But repeated decisions, made the same way over enough years, eventually stop requiring the argument. The decision becomes closer to identity than to choice. I do this because this is what I do rather than I want not to, but I will anyway. This sounds subtle and it is genuinely subtle, but the internal experience of it is significant. A man whose internal world is full of unresolved arguments, between desire and discipline, between comfort and standard, spends enormous internal energy on conflicts that never fully resolve. The Sigma male's internal world, on the practices he has held longest, is quieter specifically because those arguments concluded years ago. Not through victory exactly, through erosion. The desire side of the argument simply got less airtime, repeatedly, until it stopped showing up to argue. What replaces the argument is not nothing. It is something closer to momentum, an internal sense of simply continuing in a direction, the way a habit continues, without the friction that a live decision would generate. This is part of what reads, from outside, as effortless discipline. From inside, it is not effortless. It is just no longer an argument. 6. The one feeling he has stopped trying to resolve. I want to be careful here, because this point risks sounding more mystical than I intended. So let me ground it in something specific. In 2004, the Stoic scholar Pierre Hadot's work on ancient philosophy as a way of life was translated more widely into English, and one of the ideas that gained renewed attention was the ancient concept that certain feelings are not problems to be solved, but conditions to be lived inside. The Stoics and the Epicureans, despite their disagreements, shared an assumption that modern psychology often does not, that some discomforts are permanent features of a conscious life, not symptoms of something wrong that needs fixing. The internal world of the Sigma male contains, I think, an ongoing low-grade awareness, not constant, not overwhelming, but present often enough to be familiar, of something that does not have a clean name, something adjacent to loneliness but not quite that, something closer to the awareness that comes from having built an internal world that very few people have access to, and the quiet knowledge that this is partly his own choice, and the smaller, harder to admit knowledge that the choice came with a cost he does not regret but does still feel. What is genuinely different about him is not that he does not feel this. It is that he has stopped trying to resolve it. Most people, encountering a persistent, uncomfortable feeling, search for the thing that will make it stop. A relationship, an achievement, a change of circumstance. He has at some point stopped searching, not from resignation, from the recognition that this feeling is not a malfunction. It is the accurate internal signal of a specific kind of life. One with depth, with solitude, with standards that most people around him do not share. The feeling is not separate from the life. It is part of what the life feels like from the inside. He has made peace with it the way you make peace with weather. Not by liking it, by no longer being surprised when it arrives. 7. The moment his internal world becomes visible, and why it almost never does. There is very occasionally a moment where something from this internal world surfaces, visible for a few seconds to someone else, usually unintentional. A comment that reveals more than he meant it to. A reaction to something that does not match what the situation seemed to call for, because it was responding to something internal that the other person could not see. A long pause before an answer that in retrospect was not hesitation. It was the internal world briefly being consulted before the external one received a reply. These moments are rare, and I think the rarity is not really a choice in the way it might look. It is closer to a translation problem. The internal world described across this entire video, the quieted inner voice, the tolerance for disorientation, the structural curiosity, the scaled relationship with time, the absence of internal argument, the feeling he stopped trying to resolve. None of it has a natural vocabulary in ordinary conversation. Try right now to imagine explaining any of these 7 points to someone in casual conversation, in real time, without it sounding strange or performative, or like something from a different kind of conversation entirely. It does not translate. Not because it is secret, because the words for it were not built for small talk, so it stays internal, not hidden, just untranslated. And the people around him continue to experience him as quiet, calm, sometimes distant, occasionally surprising in a reaction they cannot quite place, without ever encountering the actual internal world that produces all of it. This is not a tragedy. He is not lonely in the way that implies suffering, most of the time. But there is something genuinely poignant in it, and I think it is worth naming plainly. An entire internal architecture, built over years, that almost no one will ever see directly, not because it is being protected, but because there has never been a bridge built for it to cross on. It exists, it shapes everything, and it remains mostly his alone. So that is the attempt, an honest one, not a complete one, at describing something that mostly does not get described, not the behavior, the internal weather underneath it, quieter inner voice, the disorientation he stayed inside long enough to grow through, the structural curiosity that fills the space social noise used to occupy, a relationship with time that makes single days feel smaller without feeling less real, internal arguments that mostly concluded years ago, a feeling he stopped trying to fix, and an internal world that almost never crosses into language, not from secrecy, but because nothing built the bridge. If any part of this felt less like information and more like recognition, like something you already carry but have never had named, that is exactly who the silent discipline was written for. It is the practical companion to everything in this video, the daily framework that builds the conditions for this kind of internal world to form. It is free. The link is in the description. If tonight's video gave you language for something you already sensed, the guide gives you the path toward it. One question before I go, and I mean this one quietly, not as a hook. Is there a feeling you have been trying to resolve for a long time that might actually just be the accurate signal of the life you have built? Not a problem, but a description? You do not need to answer that tonight. Just let it sit. This is Silent Wise. Good night.